Well, I really like this analog write command. Yesterday we were able to make this light gradually go from off to fully bright by sequentially adding a little bit of value to its light value, right? The analog write tool worked really well for that. But there's a couple drawbacks, right? For one, well, it's kind of steppy, like it kind of gets brighter and brighter and brighter, but not really too gradual. And the other thing is that if we wanted to make it gradual, we would have to make this program be really long, which some of you guys did an awesome job of yesterday. What if we were to have something like this, where when we run a code, it goes perfectly gradual, like this, from 0 all the way up to 255, or whatever we wanted to do. A program where it just goes all the way up to its maximum brightness and then repeats. This is what I want to do today. This is the next step in our learning, and that's by learning how to use a variable. Variables are, well, they're like storage containers for numbers. We use them a lot with analog outputs because of all the numbers that we use. Comparing analog output to digital output, where there's only two options, high or low, analog outputs have a lot of numbers, between 0 and 255. So we can use variables in any place that we would use a number, and it allows us to make programs that are a lot smaller, and it simplifies everything for us. The goal today, guys, is I want you to make a program. I want you to program an LED to gradually dim from its maximum value, 255, to its minimum value, which is 0, using a variable. Here's a program that's kind of already been done, but this one goes from 0 to 255. If we take a look at this really quick before we go into the specifics, you can see this thing right here, fade. Fade's the name of the variable that this person came up with. And they give it an initial value where fade is equal to 0. And then they plug the word fade into their analog write function. You can see down here, before we get into the specifics, they actually have an equation where fade is equal to fade plus 1, and that repeats every 30 milliseconds. The value of fade will actually grow by 1, and that allows this very gradual growth of light to happen. So let me show you a little bit about variables. So let's write some of these things down. All right. Sorry, I was kind of writing some of this a moment ago. So the first thing, there's some rules with variables. 3 main rules. The first rule is that variables must begin with a letter. You remember, with programming, there's a lot of just rules we have to follow. And one rule that we have is that we can't, for example, have, if we have a variable called light value, we can't have that actually be, like starting with a number. That wouldn't work. All right? So make sure that you always start with a letter. The next thing is your variable, the name for the variable cannot have spaces. Instead, we have to use an underscore. So for example, we might have something like light underscore value. Or we could just combine it into one word. The third rule is, and the final rule, is that variables are case sensitive. And what I mean by that is that, like, if we had a variable like this, fade, that isn't equal to capital fade. All right? The computer would read these as 2 completely separate variables. All right, so just make sure that we understand these 3 rules, you have them written down, and then it'll just make things a lot easier. So there's this thing called declaring variables. So why don't we just say using variables? There's a couple things that we have to do. The first thing is that we have to give it the variable a name. So for example, if we go back to this program here, here the person gave the variable a name, and it's fade. I'll talk about this int in a moment, but just to illustrate something, if we were to put in, like let's say, if we were to call it 1 fade, that's going to give us an error message because we can't start a variable with a number, right? So we have to give the variable a name, and then the second thing is we have to give the variable a type. The type of variable that we're going to be using in this class almost always is int. That stands for integer. And I don't want to get you too confused about this, but the computer will actually, for different types of variables, it will assign certain amounts of memory to that variable. And an integer variable can actually give us numbers ranging from negative 32,768 all the way up to positive 32,768. That probably sounds really random, but it has to deal with the way that computers store their data, which is in this case it's a 16-bit integer, which is 2 to the 15th power. Confusing. So I would just simplify it for our sake. In eTech, almost, I think all of our variables would be integers, numbers that fall within this range. All right, and I guess the last thing would be we have to give the variable a starting value. Now I'll show you how to do all those things right now. So we're going to give it a name, give the variable a type, and give the variable a starting value. Let's create a program here that kind of does the opposite of our goal. All right, we want to make a LED go from its maximum value to its minimum value. I'm going to show you how to do the opposite of that right here, so that you still have to kind of think for yourself a little bit for the task today. So here's how it works. Normally we always start off a program with void setup. Let's do that again. We're going to make a few changes here in a moment though. And in our void setup, we're going to be working with pin 5 today. Now, when we create a variable, we have to, almost always we create that variable way up on top of the program, the very first thing we write. So here's how it goes. I'm going to declare a variable here. I'm going to give it a name and a type. The type of variable is going to be an integer. So I type int space, and I give my variable a name. Let's call it something descriptive. Since this is going to be describing the level of brightness, why don't I call it, let's call it light. Light value. I can't have my first letter be uppercase, and I can't have any spaces. So light value. So the second thing that I have to do here is give I also have to give the variable, I gave the variable a type and a name, but I have to give it a starting value now. So I do that in the void setup. So I would say light value is equal to 0, right? Because I'm doing the opposite of what our goal is today. So the light value is equal to 0, and then I'm done with my void setup. So check this out. There's my variable. This is my variable type, and this is my starting value. Now we go into our void loop. Remember, every program we ever will make always has a void setup and a void loop. Now, within my program, I'm going to use since we're going to be gradually fading a light from 0 to 255, I still type in analog write. Pin 5, right? This will always correspond. Now remember when I said that variables are like storage containers for numbers. Anywhere we use a number, you can use a variable. So anywhere I use a number, I'm going to use a variable. Yesterday we typed in the number 0. Today though, I'm going to type in light value. So right now, pin 5 is going to start with a value of 0. But immediately, I want that number to start to grow. So with variables, we can do any math equation you can think of. So I'm going to type in light value is equal to, and then I just type in light value plus 1. So now, and during this line of code, light value is equal to 0. But then during this value, and then as we go down through the program, it's going to get a little bit bigger every, let's say, 30 milliseconds. And then this program is done. That's it. Now this is kind of the opposite of what I'm asking you guys to do today. But if we were to run a code like this, you can see here the light's growing, and the variable is called fade. But every 30 milliseconds, the value of the light grows up by 1. It goes all the way up to 255, and then it just repeats. So let's just go back to the goal today. I want it to go from maximum to its minimum value using a variable, so that light should very gradually fade all the way out. But let me point out a few things you can do once you get this done. I think it'd be really cool to create a light show from 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. See if you can get each of these to sequentially turn on or off. See if you can play around with different outputs. So you don't have to just use pin 5. Feel free to go in here and create, activate different pins and get them to turn on. You can also go ahead. So for example, once you get into activity 6, we're talking about different programming structures, if this, then that. This is gets a little confusing, so it'd be really cool if you could maybe read through this and try to experiment with the if this or the if statement. All right, so that's kind of where we're headed tomorrow, so maybe you can get started with that today. If you get confused today, chances are there's people in class that can help you out. Or, when worse comes to worse, you can actually read through some of the stuff on activity number 5, where it talks about integers, and it talks about how to create a variable. It gives you a few things that I didn't even talk about. All right, so that's the goal. Good luck.